So I just watched Red Dawn, the original from the 80s. And at first I was kind of skeptical because first I only heard of the remake and I didn't even know that it was a remake. And well, the remake is really bad, so let's not even get into that. The remake has so many flaws, and it isn't even really a remake because the remake completely misses the point of the original. Well, of course, first off, with the remake, I think the remake was from 2012. Originally, you had China as the invaders, which already doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then they changed it to North Korea because they figured, well, if they make China into the bad guy, then they're not gonna be able to sell their movie in China. So and North Korea, on the other hand, doesn't really have a movie market to begin with. So yeah, let's make North Korea into the bad guys, which is completely ludicrous because there's just no way for North Korea to completely invade the U.S. The entire homeland. There's just no way, and it's just so obvious. But that's not even. I mean, that's the most obvious flaw of the remake, but that's not even the major flaw. The major flaw of the remake, in my opinion, is, like I said, it completely misses the point of the original, because the original wasn't really about, some people were also attacking the original, saying, oh yeah, it was too patriotic, and it glorified the right to carry arms. Actually, no. At least that's not at all what I got out of it. It's not like it's glorifying those resistance fighters, so to say, at all. They do start out like your typical civilians, and they have arms because of the Second Amendment, or because their daddies are hunters or whatever. That's kind of the way they start out, and you can see that even in their clothes, and the way they're dressed at the beginning, and the kinds of weapons they have at the beginning. They start out like Boy Scouts. They start out dressed like Boy Scouts, and they do have guns, but they have like hunting rifles. That's how they start out at the beginning. But at the end, that's not at all what they look like at the end. At the end, they're wearing at the end they basically look like communist guerrillas themselves. They look like communist resistance fighters, and they really look like communist resistance fighters, even though they are fighting the communists. But they look like communist resistance fighters because they're wearing the same military clothes that the invading army is wearing, and they're using their weapons. So in the end, they completely look like communist resistance fighters. Now I'm talking about the original, because in the original, the invading army was the Soviet Union, which at that time in the 80s kind of made sense. I mean, it would have been possible, and it was actually based on the movie was actually based on scenarios that the U.S. Army was training for at that time. So it was at that time. It was a somewhat realistic scenario, but that's not what the movie is about. It's not about realistically portraying a war like that, because I feel it's really about it's about the kids and the transition the kids go through, how they go from fighting the enemy to kind of becoming what they're fighting for. And I feel that's always the case. If you use violence if there is a violent force, and you use violence against that violent force, you kind of become what you're fighting against. And for me, that was kind of the point of the movie. And that point is not lost on the screenwriters of the original, and it's not lost on the characters. The characters all acknowledge that. They all realize that. Even the officers of the invading army. In the original, it was the Soviet Union and Cuba. So there is like this Cuban military officer who realizes, the similarities. Who realizes how those kids who are fighting against them, how those resistance fighters in the U.S. That are fighting against the Cubans and the Soviet Union. He realizes how similar they are to the way he himself was when he was fighting he was fighting the guerrilla war in Cuba.
Pues mira, siempre estuve del lado de los insurrectos. No tengo experiencia en estos casos, pero me parece necesario ganar el apoyo del pueblo, como los contrarios nuestros en Vietnam decían. Ganar sus corazones y sus mentes. Повстанники.
Какие повстанцы? Это разбойники!
Mátalos! Каждый раз стреляю, революция растет. Я знаю, я был партизаном.
Теперь что вы такое?
Теперь я как вы, милиционер.
And the kids also realize how they are changing, how they are, because one of the main reasons why they start to oppose the invading army and start to organize their resistance and start to become resistance fighters is because they see how the invading army executes basically innocent people, or anybody who has a different opinion. And as the movie progresses, they also start to execute people they consider spies and stuff like that. And they realize how similar they are becoming to the invaders. So anyway, if you haven't watched the movie, go watch the movie. I think in that regard, it is a really powerful movie, and it really illustrates, for me, it doesn't glorify violence at all, quite the opposite. It really illustrates the futility of fighting violence with violence, and of how two opposing sides that outwardly seem to be, completely different and seem to be opposing and fighting one another can actually become very similar. And actually, in most cases, that's why wars are kind of fought in two ways. On the one hand, they are being fought with violence, and on the other hand, it's a war of ideology. Whereas if you manage to infiltrate the enemy, so to say, you can actually make him become like you without him realizing it. And that's actually kind of the whole point of terrorist attacks to begin with, of terrorist groups. Originally, the remake was supposed to have been about like the Taliban or something invading the US, which again that's not a realistic scenario either. But if they would have made the remake with terrorists, it kind of at least still kind of made the point that that basically both are terrorists. The invaders are terrorists, and the resistance fighters are terrorists as well. And that's kind of the whole point of terrorism. So you might think, yeah, well, why is there terrorism to begin with? I mean, doesn't everyone realize that that kind of violence is completely pointless? Of course it's pointless, and of course it's evil, but the point is that if there is a terrorist attack, any terrorist attack, then the nation where the terrorist attack occurs, or the target of that terrorist attack, is put in a difficult situation, because if they ignore it, the populace will think, what are you doing? Those are terrorists. They're attacking us. They're blowing up our buildings, and you do nothing. If the government ignores terrorist attacks, then the people will start to attack their own government, and start to oppose their own government because of the government's inaction, which is precisely what the terrorists want. They want to attack that nation, and weaken that nation, and the best way to do that is to make their own people oppose their government. So the point is, if there is a terrorist attack and the government doesn't do anything about it, their own people will oppose the government for their inactions, and the terrorists win. If the government, on the other hand, does something about it, and really takes it seriously, and enacts stricter laws and more gun control and stuff like that, then again, the population will be unhappy and will start to oppose their own government, seeing it as an attack by the government on their own people, seeing their own government, thinking that their own government is becoming more authoritarian, and is becoming more like the authoritarian regime that maybe was behind the terrorist attack to begin with. So that's kind of the point, It's an attack on basically the government of the enemy. It's a terrorist attack never has so for example, if there's a terrorist attack and the terrorists blow up a certain building, that building is not the target of the attack. It's to basically to destabilize the government, bringing the government into a position where either their own population will distrust the government. Well, in either case, their own population will start to distrust the government, and if they do something about the terrorist attacks, then they will increasingly become like the authoritarian regime that is behind the terrorist attacks. And that's kind of really well illustrated in this movie, how basically violence causes more violence, and how the oppressed become more and more like the oppressor if they go down the path of violence. So I think it's a very powerful movie, and it's precisely against violence. It has a very strong message against violence, at least for me.